Okay, hi. I got it. Thank you. Okay, hi everyone. I'm Heather Pizzanello. I'm a faculty member in the social work department at Salve Regina University, and I'm facilitating as the moderator just a book discussion about Steve Orland's To Fool the Rain, Hades Poor and Their Pathway to a Better Life. So I work closely with the Salve students, Salve Regina students, but anyone who's here can feel free to participate. I use some specific quotes to bring us into the world of the book in case you didn't get to read it or it wasn't assigned to you as a student, but then I also then broaden out with the questions that I ask. So most of the questions are general, so many people can participate about the topic more broadly speaking, but some of the quotes are just to illustrate what the author talks about in the book itself and to bring you more into the world of the author and his discussion. So the first question I have is, and I'm sharing my screen just so people can see the written version as well. When discussing the ongoing precarious state that Haiti's poorest families live in, Berlin states, an illness, an accident, a little bad weather, it doesn't take much to turn a difficult life into misery. Their homes provide no shelter. Though the roofs offer some shade, those who dwell beneath them are sure to get soaked with every rain. Haitians have a way of describing such roofs. They can fool the sun, but they can't fool the rain. He also goes on to describe how during downpours, which can be almost daily, the efforts of parents, caregivers to find some form of cover from the rain for their children, which can involve moving their small children around on the floor, setting them down on whatever spots seem driest, sometimes finding a corner where the roof is more or less holding up, sometimes pushing them under a bed if they have a bed. And so my first question is just what stands out to you about this passage? What in particular seems striking about his description in terms of how it doesn't take much to turn a difficult life into misery and how their homes provide no shelter or not enough shelter to cool the rain, which is the primary phrasing and the title of the book. So thoughts?
I can contribute.
Sure.
So I'm Ashley. I'm a senior social work major at Salve. So we did have the opportunity to read this book. And for me, like what's striking is that these individuals are already going through so much with the lack of available resources that they have. They don't really even have the basic needs that we might have here in this country. Some of them really need water, they need food and shelter, so that if one little thing does happen to them, it could be completely drastic. It could have a really big effect on them. We have to know that we have our privilege. Like I said already, some of them don't even have clean water to drink, and that's something that we often don't even have to worry about right here where we live. Even though they could have done their best to make shelter for themselves, sometimes it's truly not even inhabitable, especially if they do have young children with them. When I think of the term "to fool the rain," I think of it as meaning that the shelter that they do have would not even sustain any type of rainfall, and it would not, in quotations, fool it by putting protection against it. The rain in turn would penetrate their home and destroy the little belongings that they do have. They have so little to work with, and they have to scavenge for whatever they can to protect themselves from the elements. An example I have from the book is that there is a woman named Jean Marie. She actually didn't have anything before starting this program. She even said, in quotations, "I have nothing at all." She was born into an extremely poor family and was even living in a domestic servitude. Um, After this program, actually, they were able to help her build a home for herself and her 8-year-old boy. So before the program, she wasn't able to fool the rain, but luckily after she was, because she had that shelter to protect her and her little boy, and it helped her so much. She was always talking about, I have things now for myself, and she had that self-determination after this program. She was able to do it herself. The people that were in this program just helped to guide her along in that process.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ashley. Did anyone else?
I didn't read the book, but
Mhm.
I think it's kind of cool to come in with that perspective of not having the history with it,
Mhm.
but just kind of look. It's a visceral description for me of oppression, and it seems like the author uses a lot of symbolism when he talks about, um, even dwelling beneath these roofs, they're sure to get soaked, and despite the roofs not providing shelter, it's already a difficult life. So it feels like a
Mhm.
very visceral, symbolic experience
Mhm.
experience of oppression.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next question. Okay, so I have another direct quote here. Ask, what are your thoughts, feelings, and responses, particularly after engaging with To Fool the Rain, to the author's statement that the most important thing that our program has taught us is that extremely poor women can improve their lives if they are given a reasonable chance to do so. That lesson directly implies a corollary. Extremely poor families suffer the deprivations of their poverty because those of us who give them that chance do not decide to help. Extreme poverty exists because we don't choose to eliminate it. So just gut level thoughts or feelings or responses to this idea that extreme poverty exists because no one on a global level chooses to help eliminate it. That was his observation. And that this is what the program has taught them, that if you help to facilitate and empower the people that you're working with, that they do have the capacity to overcome extreme poverty and deprivation. But there's so many people that choose to do nothing.
I have a comment.
Mhm.
This quote kind of, I remember I highlighted it when I was reading the book because it reminded me that, or it kind of shows that a lot of these people want to improve their life, but just because of the situations, like they don't even know where to begin. Like they want to do something to help themselves, but if you don't have those resources to may help you start, then you it's impossible to go anywhere if you don't know where to begin. So that's why I liked in this book that they weren't just giving them things, they were like giving them the resources to improve their lives themselves, which
Mhm.
also reminded me about, like we talk about all the time, and Nicole mentioned in her Indigenous presentation that self-determination is really important, and like this shows that if they are given the options, that they will use their own self-determination to try to make a change in their life.
Mhm. Thank you.
I think it takes the blame off the individual
Mhm.
too, because I
Mhm.
think that a
Yeah.
lot of people can look at poverty as a character flaw
Mhm.
in people, or lack
Which
of
I know
motivation.
definitely in the US happens
Yeah,
all the time.
especially here with extreme judgment. So I
Mhm.
like this quote that it's the external circumstances that
Mhm.
need to get better to help people globally
Mhm.
move from living out of in poverty.
And
I
we all as a collective play a role in letting it continue and
Mhm.
letting it happen, and like that whole collective we that our keynote speaker spoke about.
I also think, in a way, it's kind of just like ignorance on everyone else, kind of like turning their head to poverty. Even in the book itself, like Stephen said, like I have a quote from page 79. He said, and nothing was more foreign to me than the simplest fact of their poverty, the hunger many rural Haitians deal with every day, and like them not knowing when their next meal will come and how he could even go about helping them. But I
Mhm.
think it's important that we obviously pay attention to these things and listen to the people first instead of just like implementing our thoughts and our feelings
Mhm.
onto what we think they should do to better themselves, and
Mhm.
understand that everyone has a story and
Mhm.
comes from a different place than us, and that story is really important to like foster their connections and build up their resilience and help them through that as well.
Mhm. Thank you. Any other thoughts or responses to that question, that passage?
Yeah, I actually did not read the book, but
Mhm.
just going off that quote that you gave, I think
Mhm.
looking at what our society does today,
Mhm.
I know a lot of people joke and meme about, the two billionaires that we have racing for fun in space, when there's so many people in need. And the truth of the matter is, it's very expensive to be poor.
Mhm.
Um, Growing up myself in a very low income family, seeing firsthand what my family went through and what other families went through in my neighborhood,
Mhm.
it's very difficult and very expensive to get very basic necessity and needs.
Mhm.
So I can only imagine what these people in Haiti are going through, probably even worse. And for them to even start to better themselves and better the communities, is probably one almost, I want to say, near impossible. But
Mhm.
I do have the book, so I will be reading it. So
Okay, awesome. Thank you. And those are important points. And I've seen information out there that it talks about. So even like in the US, we wonder why people don't have jobs or work. But when you're living in poverty, I saw something which is really important about, or a key point that I never thought of, about how important it is, or sorry, how expensive it is to even work or to have a job, because you have to have a car that's running, you have to be able to afford to put gas in the car. If you're a parent, you have to like
Daycare.
have someone take care of your kids or pay for daycare. And then paralleling to, Haiti, where he talks about poverty there looks even, different than it does in the US, and in some ways is much more kind of extreme than even our version of poverty, which it is hard to look at and think about or live in. So it's really important points that we don't really think about. Thank you. Okay, so what do you think of the fact that I had this down, this phonetic pronunciation. I did it phonetically and now I can't pronounce it again in my mind again. Funkazulu, the CML program that Werlin, the author, is engaged in. What do you think about the fact that it works to address gender inequity in Haiti and patterns of social isolation by giving 96% of its loans to women?
I thought that it was really important because it talked a lot in the book that men often dominate poor households because the women don't really have a way to earn money on their own. And then sometimes they also, like, the men feel threatened by women like gaining independence and having like a separate livelihood. And I think like this allows them to have an opportunity to break free from that and just empower them to go ahead and like start doing things for themselves and on their own instead of letting the men in their household dominate them.
Yep. Thank you. Any other thoughts about this?
I'm sure, Haiti, just like other countries, especially countries that I want to work with in Central America, South America, it's a very patriarchal system. So it must be very difficult for these women to get, really anything in education, rights to work. So again, I think that's really awesome of them giving loans to women, just because to break some of our systemic barriers, it's important to support everyone in the community, no matter race, gender, religion. So I'm sure for Haiti, that definitely has a really big impact.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I also just found a quote that I highlighted from chapter 6, and it was talking about how there's like a sexual order and that men dominate poor households in part because their children's mothers have no way to earn money on their own. They sometimes feel threatened by the prospect of a woman building the independence that having a separate livelihood could bring. So obviously that's just like, it just shows that it's like awesome that they're giving a lot of their loans to women because they're a lot of times not able to have, they've never had their own way to like make their own money.
Thank you. Okay, and Dr. Farmer's forward to the book, To the Full of the Rain, he states that CLM, the program the author works for and writes about, the name is derived from the Haitian Creole phrase, which roughly translates to shoulder to shoulder foundation, evoking a promise of accompaniment. This notion of accompaniment, I can't talk anymore, of standing shoulder to shoulder with patients or clients eschews traditional notions of charity and instead calls for pragmatic solidarity and unconditional partnership with those in need. what do you think of this notion of solidarity and creating an unconditional partnership with those in need? And then the next question goes into kind of, if you got to read the book, asking about like just illustrations that come to mind of where this occurred in the book, but just more broadly, what do you think of this notion of solidarity and creating an unconditional partnership with those in need?
I think that's so in keeping with the tone of this entire conference, right? When we talked initially about shifting our perspectives from a needs-based approach to a rights-based approach, I really appreciated being able to think about these mission trips that students are taking in a much more thoughtful way, and on a much more even playing field. And I think that this is super reflective of the whole tone of kind of the time we spent together.
Yep. And then I also ask if you got to look at the book or engage with the book in any way, and it can be talking about it generally, it doesn't need to go into specifics. And some of you already mentioned this a little bit in reference to the other questions, but in general, how do we see illustrations of standing shoulder to shoulder and partnering with those in need happening in the book itself?
This applies to kind of both questions, but I just think that this kind of way of helping is a lot more like sustainable, and it's not like, oh, I'm just going to give you money or food or donations, and then once that runs out, like what else is there? And I know, like right at the end of the book, it's like on one of the last pages, they're talking about one of the women in it, and it's like she still has to hike to the market several times each week to buy or sell, as she struggles to further build her livelihood, but she faces those challenges with a new set of tools at her disposal. So it's like giving them things instead of like giving them tools, so that if you're no longer there, then they can still kind of help themselves with what you've taught them.
Yep, wonderful.
I also talked about, there was a woman named Salamene, and Stephen talked about how like he learned more from working with her than he feels like she learned from working with them. And I think I have a quote to show, like, standing shoulder to shoulder with and partnering with those in need. He said, until we learn to take the time we need to understand what is getting in a person's way as they struggle to change their life, we will have little chance of providing the help that she needs unless we do so. So I think like that quote in itself, like really shows that.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? And how does this model or practice of standing shoulder to shoulder with and partnering with those in need align with the field of social work's values and code of ethics?
I guess just like we talk a lot about in class, especially collaboration, empowerment, active listening, being empathetic. So all of those values definitely coincide with social work and what was being done here.
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
I think
Heather,
just
go ahead, Kelly.
Oh, I was just thinking of our person and environment perspective. That's so important, especially when we're working with folks who are experiencing poverty. I think it's really important.
I was just going to say that I just think that so many of our social work values, service, and thinking about the importance of human relationships and dignity and worth. I mean, they all fit here. That, when you're not doing to a person, but doing with them and in solidarity with them, that these, it just resonates with our values.
Yep. So also thinking about self-determination and then empowerment, which other people were talking about, respect for diversity, integrity of a person. So lines very much so with our code of ethics. And what do you think of the notion discussed in the foreword and at various points into Fool the Rain that there is no single pathway to a better life? And how does this notion or idea connect with what we read in To Fool the Rain, or what we saw in To Fool the Rain?
So for me, I thought that this notion directly related because as we read, there are literally so many different types of women in this book, and they all come from so many different backgrounds and ways of life. Not one of them is truly the same. And a few examples that I have is that one mother may truly need a house for protection, like I talked about before, which is Jean Marie. One of them, which is like Selaman. I looked it up to try and pronounce it correctly. Dr. Mamini Dana, I promise. She had to work a lot on her literacy skills. And then each of these women have something that they really want to work on and improve in order to get not only a better life for themselves, but many of the women in these books have either one child or multiple that they really need to take care of as well. And then, like, for example, there may be individuals that have the resources they need. There's a woman named Marie Paul, and she has her livestock, but sometimes she doesn't use it to the right way. And she even had a small business that unfortunately she had to cash out. So, like, kind of relating to the question beforehand, we need these people in this program to stand shoulder to shoulder with these women because they may have what they necessarily need, but there's not often taught the way to use it or to make it in a way so they can profit. And I know, like, reading this book, like, all these women do have like such self-determination. It's just getting that slight push to do so and to get to that point where they can be sustainable not only for themselves but for their kids and others as well.
Thank you. Any other thoughts about this?
I just think I know, like, in class when I do like my check-ins, I talk a lot about every child that I'm working with has trauma, but all of the trauma looks different and was caused by something different. So just because someone is in poverty, that doesn't mean that like it looks the same across the board. So I think it's important to really listen to the stories throughout the book and realize that yes, they're all poverty stricken, but their situations are all very different and they all need very different things in order to succeed.
Yep. And it also reminds me of this idea of like the client is the expert, or the person that we're working with is the expert on their own situation. So again, we might have an idea of what the path is or the pathway is, but that's not necessarily what the pathway needs to be for them, which again lines back up with a lot of the social work code of ethics and values that we've been talking about. And do you think the model of assistance illustrated and discussed in To Fool the Rain is sustainable? Why or why not? So the model of global assistance or model of assistance used?
I think it's definitely more sustainable than kind of the idea that a lot of us have about foreign aid and like bringing in different like donations and stuff, because that's not, obviously that comes from a good place and that comes from people that do want to help, but at the end of the day it's not helping them to be as independent as they could be. And I know for in our international class we read this, but we also had to watch a documentary called Poverty Inc., which talked about like how that idea of foreign aid, it comes from a good place, but it's actually can have a lot of negative effects on the people because their kind of economy suffers because they're not making their own resources, they're just getting resources from other people. So because in class we had to like connect those two, and that's the biggest thing I noticed was that in To Fool the Rain they weren't just giving people things, they were trying to have them create their own small businesses and like things they could continue doing. Obviously it's still not perfect, there's definitely people that maybe didn't continue doing it for a long time, but I do think it's more sustainable than on like other methods.
Great. Other thoughts? Okay, so I don't have all of it here. I wasn't sure what things would look like in terms of time, but if you have the book, it's, at least in my edition of the book, it's pages 239 at the very bottom and starting at the top of 240, and really most of it is on 240. And it talks about Rose Marth. I don't know how to pronounce her last name, so I apologize. So Werlin says, and this is talking about graduation from the program. At graduation, her last words at graduation were, "I used to go to market without anything decent to wear. Now I'm looking good." And she did a little spin so the audience, mainly her fellow graduates and their guests, could appreciate her full ensemble. Her bright yellow polyester blouse contrasted sharply with her dark, dark skin. The little ruffles around its shoulders got in the way as she slid the handle of her purse from the crook in her bent elbow up her arm. She gave her shoulder a little flick to get the handbag all the way up over the bunched fabric to where it could hang down comfortably as she spoke. Martiniere had a protective arm across her shoulders as he introduced her, and so he's someone who works with CLM and had mentored her, and handed her the microphone. But he slid away off to the side as she began to speak. This was no longer a woman who needed his support. She still has to hike to the market several times each week to buy or sell as she struggles to further build her livelihood. But she faces those challenges with a new set of tools at her disposal. Her graduation was even more than the many academic graduations I've been part of, a commencement rather than an end. So just thoughts about that, what stands up to you about that passage that I read, what it just illustrates in terms of, the work that CLM has done and what it signifies and speaks to from a social work lens or standpoint.
I was going to say that this particular paragraph to me just speaks of such empowerment. I mean, I just love the description of her just decked out and going to this great event that she's earned, and just seems like, it's really like just a magical moment. There's something so uplifting about this for me.
And just the confidence that's portrayed in terms of how she feels about herself. And she talks about not having anything decent to wear. And it, obviously it goes beyond the materialistic, but you can see how empowered, how self-assured she feels, and just how powerful that is. And the fact that he had a protective arm across her shoulders as he introduced her and handed her the microphone, but he slid away off to the side as she began to speak. This was no longer a woman who needed his support. And just, again, how powerful that is. Any other thoughts or reactions to that passage?
I think the passage itself is very beautiful. Not only does it speak empowerment towards the woman, but also as a social work perspective, it's definitely planting the seeds in hopes that it, gets passed along to someone else in the community in hopes of changing their environment. And, it's a great way to practice being a human and seeing change and stuff like that. So I think the passage was great.
Thank you. Okay. And then for just everyone who got to take a look at To Fool the Rain, is there anything else that we haven't talked about or touched upon that kind of resonated with you that you want to mention or talk about? Speak to?
I really liked that. This is like kind of random, but I liked that there was like a lot of photos in it, and I feel like it added to the book that you were able to see like what these people looked like, and it gave you more of like a idea of who the book was about, and it wasn't just like this guy going like, yeah, obviously there's a lot of writing, but I liked that they incorporated that into it.
I feel like it definitely humanized who he was talking about, and it was really powerful. And just looking at the photos themselves, they seem to be really thoughtfully done. If I think to our first keynote speaker and how she talked about, you know, photographing or presenting photos of, you know, programs that we engage in other kind of communities or other countries, and just being careful about how things are portrayed. And there was a lot of humanity and a lot of intentionality and thought put into, I think, how the photos were portrayed, and then how it also gave you a sense of and personalized really the person's story and the person that he was talking about that he had worked with. Anything else?
I liked how they like really immersed themselves within the culture, and just learned throughout the whole experience, and they weren't like whitewashing anything either, which I think was really nice. And they understood like the power dynamic as well. I know in one of the chapters they talked about like jealousy and just like how they threaten the existing power throughout like the households, but also the community in general, and they were very aware of that, which I think is super important.
And just curious, I haven't seen Poverty Inc., but I think at least one person mentioned it. How, I mean, we only have a few minutes, but in general, like how does it connect up or align with To Fool the Rain, just generally speaking?
So I was actually going to mention something about this. And To Fool the Rain, whether they talk about it from the author or through the stories, it shows a lot about teaching people how to do things for themselves. But Poverty Inc. talked a lot about just doing things for people. So it talked about how organizations will just give things to the people when tragedy happens. But To Fool the Rain really showed me that you have to be able to work with people and teach them how to do things, because that's more sustainable for them. Because when the organizations leave, then the people are kind of left high and dry, and they don't know how to provide for themselves anymore, because it showed a lot about being dependent. But in To Fool the Rain, it shows that you need to teach them, because that's how they're going to be able to keep it up for the long time and provide for their families for generations and generations.
Thank you.
I think it also Poverty Inc. really talks about some of the unanticipated consequences. So well-meaning, really good souls, good people doing good things, and maybe not thinking the whole narrative through. And one of the examples that they use is Tom's shoes. If you buy a pair, give a pair.
Yes.
And so it sounds like a beautiful arrangement, right?
Right.
And so, but then just talking about, then does that, take away from the country's ability to manufacture shoes, or just, so just sort of thinking about, not that you shouldn't do that, but that there should be this really, thoughtful approach to, start playing it out, what's happening, in the moment, what will happen down the road with this kind of giving. So.
Right. And then it also reminds me of what someone was saying in response to the keynote speaker last night, where he was saying like there was this assumption by, I think it was well-meaning high school students, that the kids needed to, the students needed to help the kids in the community have clean clothes or wash their clothes, but that's not really what they needed. So asking people from the community themselves, like, what can we work on together? What would be helpful versus just assuming and making this assumption. Anything else? Okay. So we think we're pretty close to, we only have like 4 more minutes. So if no one wanted to add anything else, I just want to say thank you to everyone. Thank you to the students and everyone else who participated. And I'm not sure, I think Sigfredo is still here in terms of putting up the overall conference evaluation link for people who are licensed clinicians who are looking to get the CEUs for attending tonight.
Yeah, I'm gonna post that up right now, actually. And I'll be leaving that in the chat.
Okay, wonderful.
Yesterday was inaccessible, so I am gonna stay on a little bit. And if it doesn't work, I will get that fixed as quick as possible. So I went ahead and posted that.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. So thank you to everyone who participated, and have a good night. And the link is in the chat. Okay.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm gonna test this out and see.
It's working. I got in last night. I couldn't get in.
Okay. Yeah,
Nice.
no, I think there was some type of just general issue last night. Okay, awesome.
Yeah, Janice had it locked to Wit and Mercy people, so I think she went ahead and changed that, so it should be accessible to everyone.
Yeah, awesome. I mean, there's so many like pieces to putting a conference like this together. I mean, you guys did an amazing job. So
Yes.
it just so many like nuances and little pieces. So thank you so much. All right.
Good night, all.
Fredo. Good night. Thank you.
And I thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good
Thanks.
night.
Good night.
Thank you. Oh,
you.
what happened to that? I was in the form and now I